A grown man in first century Galilee could work 12 hours under the sun and still go to bed hungry. Not because there was no food, because almost everything he earned that day was already spoken for before he even sat down to eat. Here's the number that should stop you. According to the parable in Matthew chapter 20 verse 2, a day labourer earned 1 denarius for a full day's work. 1 coin. And economic historians who study Roman period price records, including the price edict issued by the Emperor Diocletian in the year 301, use those figures to reconstruct something startling. Most of that single coin, some scholars estimate as much as 3/4 of it, went straight into grain. Not meat, not wine, grain. You were taught the Last Supper. You were taught the fish and the loaves. But nobody ever taught you what an ordinary Tuesday actually looked like on Jesus' plate. Let's start with sunrise, because that's where the day and the hunger began. Morning, picture, waking up before the light, muscles already sore from yesterday. You don't have a pantry. You have what your household baked the night before, and it has to carry you into the field. The fear here is simple, and it's old as dirt. What happens on the day there isn't enough bread. Archaeologist Jodi Magness, who has spent decades excavating Jewish sites from this exact period and wrote extensively on daily life under Roman rule, points out that the base of almost every meal in Galilee was barley bread, not wheat. Wheat was better and pricier and mostly sold off or reserved for Sabbath. Barley was the grain of the poor, coarse, dense, filling. Breakfast, if you can even call it that, was usually a chunk of that bread dipped in olive oil, sometimes with a handful of olives on the side. Maybe a few dried figs if the season allowed it. That's it. No eggs, no cheese, most mornings. Just bread, oil, and whatever water or watered wine was in the jug. Here's the irony that gets me every time I read about this. Olive oil, the thing sitting in the fancy bottle in your kitchen right now costing you good money, was the cheapest, most everyday item on the table back then. It wasn't garnish. It was calories. It was survival. So the morning question hangs there. If bread and oil is basically it, how does a body doing manual labour all day even function? Midday. The answer starts to show up at noon, and it's not what you'd expect. Midday wasn't a big meal. It was a short break, maybe under a tree if you were lucky enough to find shade, and it was mostly more of the same bread from the morning, now a little stale, dipped again in oil, sometimes crumbled into a bowl with lentils or chickpeas that had been soaking or cooking since before dawn. Legumes did a lot of heavy lifting in this diet. Lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, cheap, filling, easy to grow on marginal land where wheat wouldn't take. Historian and economist Douglas Oakman, who has written on the agrarian economy of Roman Galilee, argues that legumes were one of the few reliable protein sources available to people who couldn't afford meat on a regular basis. And that raises the real question everyone actually clicked for. When did Jesus, or any worker like him, actually eat meat? Meat, the rarest item on the table. Here's what nobody tells you in Sunday school. Meat wasn't a weekly thing. For most working families in Galilee, it wasn't even a monthly thing. Think about why. A sheep or a goat wasn't a meal on legs. It was a walking asset. It gave you milk. It gave you wool. It gave you more sheep. Killing it for dinner meant erasing an entire income stream in exchange for one afternoon of fullness. Nobody with any sense did that on a random Wednesday. So meat showed up almost exclusively around festivals. Passover, when a lamb was required. Maybe a wedding, if the family hosting could afford it. Historian John Dominic Crossan, in his economic reconstructions of first-century Palestine, describes meat consumption among the rural poor as an occasional ceremonial event rather than a dietary staple. And fish. This is where it gets interesting, because Galilee sat right on a lake full of them. Tilapia, sardine-like fish caught in the Sea of Galilee, were far more common than red meat, especially salted or dried, which let a family stretch one catch across many days. That salted fish, sometimes turned into a pungent sauce for flavouring bread, was probably the closest thing to a daily protein most people had. And even that was a luxury compared to bread and oil. So the picture reshapes itself, not lamb chops. Salted fish flakes on bread, maybe once or twice a week if you lived near the lake. Actual roasted meat, a handful of times a year. That changes how you read every meal in the Gospels differently, doesn't it? Evening. The evening meal was the main event of the day, eaten as a family, often the only time everyone sat together. Still, it wasn't lavish. Bread again, always bread. This time maybe with a cooked vegetable stew, onions, garlic, leeks, whatever grew that season. If the family kept a goat, there might be a small amount of soured milk or a crumbled bit of fresh cheese. Wine, heavily diluted with water, rounded it out. More for hydration and to kill bacteria in the water supply than for pleasure. Now here's where the math gets uncomfortable. Historians who reconstruct caloric intake for Roman-era agricultural labourers, drawing on comparative studies of pre-industrial diets by economic historian Peter Garnsey, estimate that a working man needed roughly 3,000 calories a day for that kind of physical labour. Bread, oil, legumes, and the occasional fish could get you there. Barely. And only if the harvest held. A bad year, a drought, a Roman tax hike. Any of it could tip a family from barely enough into real hunger. That's the fear sitting under every meal in the Gospels. Not abstract poverty. The very real, very physical math of calories in versus calories burned. What was luxury? What was impossible? So what counted as luxury in this world? Refined wheat bread instead of barley. Imported wine instead of the local, rougher stuff. Honey used sparingly to sweeten anything. Dates and raisins as a treat. Real cheese, aged, not just curdled milk. And what was flat out impossible, no matter how much money you had? Sugar didn't exist yet in this region, only honey. There was no coffee, no tea, no citrus fruit as we know it today, no tomatoes, no potatoes, none of the New World crops that wouldn't reach the Mediterranean for another 15 centuries. If you handed a first century Galilean a tomato, he wouldn't know what to do with it. Compare it to now. The average American spends around 10% of household income on food, according to United States Department of Agriculture data. A first century labourer spent close to 3/4 of his. Same species, same hunger, a completely different world. I'll be honest, when you line those two numbers up side by side, "Give us this day our daily bread" stops sounding like a nice phrase. It sounds like the most literal, urgent request a person could make. Bread, oil, lentils, salted fish on a good week, meat on maybe 5 days out of the whole year. That was the real menu behind almost every meal in the Gospels. And once you know what was actually on the table, the next question gets a lot harder to ignore. What did it actually cost to throw a wedding feast in a village where families were counting every fig? That's next.